Welcome back. This is the lecture for week 10, The Flowering of Medieval Culture. And this is the only lecture for this week because this week, the end of this week, is when your second midterm is due. Again, officially, in terms of keeping pace for the course. And so that gives you extra time to focus on getting ready for the midterm. Now, this lecture, as I think I said at the beginning of last lecture, is in some ways just a continuation of last lecture, the medieval Renaissance. And there's only one written lecture for these two oral lectures. But it's because this is really focusing on developments in the 13th century. If we look at the medieval Renaissance as this extended period, not just the 12th century, but an extended period, this is really the culmination of the developments that had gone on in the beginning of the later 11th century on through the 12th and into the 13th. So we really need to see this whole development as really the flowering or flourishing of medieval culture, the medieval Renaissance, whatever you want to call it. That's not as important as it is to understand what the components thereof were and what really contributed to this change. Now, the 13th century, the period I'll be covering in this class, has often been seen as the culmination of the Middle Ages, the height of the Middle Ages, where the medieval synthesis came about, the synthesis of faith and reason, and I'll be talking about that a bit more later on. And then thereafter, it's like a high point, and then we have this decline in the later Middle Ages. Now, I'll be addressing that thesis more after the midterm, because that too is a completely ahistorical approach and is based on actually theological positions more than it is historical positions. But that is something that we'll say for after the midterm. But this really is a flourishing period of Christendom, and we need to look at some of the developments that, and some of which are still with us today. So that being said, we'll get into the details, so to speak, and go from there, and pick up in some ways where we left off last week with the recovery of Aristotle, the intellectual changes, and also the institutional changes. And I begin today too with an institutional change, namely the mendicants, because last lecture I talked about the new monasticism. There are new developments within monastic life as such, again in the 13th century. So whereas the new monasticism refers to Cluny and the Augustinian canons, the Premonstratensians, and the Cistercians, those kind of three orders or three general groups of monastic orders, these new developments in the 13th century are referred to as the mendicants. And the mendicants are kind of a problem because they too represented a challenge how to define them legally, because they're something different. They're not really monks. So what were they and how do we understand them, and what do we make of them? You may have heard of some of these. The Dominicans and the Franciscans are the two most known mendicant orders. There are two others, the Carmelites, which I'm not going to be talking much more about at all. And then the Augustinian hermits, which I'll be talking a lot about, both now and then, especially in the later Middle Ages, and for reasons that we'll see when we get to the later Middle Ages. But to understand the origins of the mendicants, and the mendicant simply means begging, means poor. A mendicant is someone who doesn't own anything. So it's like a poor beggar is a mendicant. And these orders, at least in theory, did not own anything. They were poor orders, but we'll understand that as we go through this, I think. And to understand why that developed, this mendicant movement, let's say, was because of the increasing poverty movement in the 12th century. The church, the institutional church, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, as I discussed a bit in terms of the investiture controversy and the freedom of the church movement, began to become very wealthy and powerful. And there were groups in the 12th century who began to say, wait a minute, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Christians are supposed to follow Jesus, and Jesus was, not a wealthy man. So there were these opposition groups, such as the Waldensians, the Poor of Lyon, a number of different groups, almost, let's say, protesting groups that were explicitly critical of the wealth of the institutional church. Now, they were condemned because they were, undermining the authority structure and the power structure of the ecclesiastical hierarchy as an institution. Now, that was kind of the context, because it was a problem because the Pope, whose title, Pope, simply means Papa, but the Pope, even though he referred to himself as the Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God, was wealthy. And he knew it. And a lot of the bishops were wealthy and were noblemen and so. And they knew that there was a problem here, a tension here in any case. And so when St. Francis, or actually before St. Francis became St. Francis, Francis of Assisi came along, this offered the papacy an opportunity. Now, Francis, because the Franciscans were the first mendicant order, Francis was the son of a wealthy Italian merchant, cloth merchant. In the early 13th century, supposedly, Francis is a young man going to be the heir of his father's businesses, well thought of in the city and everything else. Had a conversion experience. I'm not going to go into all the legends and stories, but the major one was that he had a vision while in a church praying before a crucifix, and Jesus on the crucifix spoke to him and told him to rebuild my church. And that Francis did, based on the model of, number one, poverty, referring to himself as the poverello, this poor, small, poor one, impoverished one. And he would be naked and poor, following the naked and poor Christ, because Christ was seen as naked and poor. And that became the model and ideal of rebuilding the church, even though for Francis, originally it meant physically rebuilding churches. There is a fantastic movie, and if I could get a hold of it, and if we had time, I would love to show it to you, but neither of those are the case. It's a Zeffirelli film called Brother, Son, Sister, Moon, and it's about Francis and his sister Claire. And there's a great scene when Francis confronts his father in the city square of Assisi and strips himself naked and says, I renounce all my inheritance. I'm not going to take anything that I have from you. I'm just going to go out and follow Christ. And he does that and starts physically rebuilding a local church that had gone into disrepair. And a number of other people started to follow Francis. This actually became somewhat popular. So Francis had a number of followers, and according to legend and tradition, there were 12 original ones. You can understand why that would be the case. 12, Francis and 12. Because Francis became to be portrayed as the second Christ, the alter Christus, another Christ. He even at one point received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, because of his literal physical imitation of Christ, the wounds on his hands and his feet and his side. And there are supposedly eyewitnesses who saw these wounds. And if there was ever a figure in the Middle Ages who was a truly spiritual, sweet, spiritual person, it was Francis of Assisi. He's one of the most attractive figures of the Middle Ages, if not of all time. Because by all counts, he was sincere and about what he was doing. Even if there's a bit of a, was he all there? Well, maybe not, but still, he was very sincere about what he was doing, and that's attractive. And he got to have followers. And pretty soon, it's like, we need to have sanction from the Pope, because we have enough people following me now that, we need to make this official, so to speak. And we need, therefore, to have a rule. And this gets into the whole history of the early Franciscan order, which I'm not going to go into all the details, but they did. They appealed to the Pope, Pope Innocent the Third, and Innocent saw, here's an opportunity. Here is a poverty movement that wants to do its work in conjunction and obedience to me, the Pope. This would be a way to claim that we are encompassing the poverty movement within the hierarchical institution. And Innocent III sanctions Francis's way of life. They become known as the Order of Friars Minor. And that works both in Latin and in English. It's the Ordo Fratrum Minorum, or OFM, becomes known as the Franciscans. And they become a distinct religious order, and they are designated to minister and rebuild churches and build up Christ's body within the towns of Italy. Now, this was somewhat the same type of a problem legally as were the Cistercians and the Premonstratensians, the regular canons, because they weren't monks. They weren't technically monks. They were technically friars, as they became to be known. Friars. And they were engaged in pastoral care. They ended up establishing their own churches in cities. And in keeping with the monastic aspect, their own cloisters. So they have a cloister within the city rather than out in the woods. So it's a very different approach. Now, shortly after the Franciscans, this was a Spanish young man named Dominic, who was also a soldier, and he had a conversion experience. And his view, he wanted to convert the infidel in the Holy Land, Islam. That was his big mission. He was going to be a soldier of Christ, going out fighting against the infidel in the Holy Land. And he got some followers around him too, and they had to be sanctioned by the Pope. And the Pope says, "Here's another one. Great, we'll take it." And he was known as the Order of Preachers, because Dominic's idea was to say, if we are going to convert these people, we have to know our stuff better than they do. We have to know their traditions better than they do. We have to know our own tradition better than anybody else. And we are going to preach the gospel based on our level of education and our knowledge. Now that then became their designation, the Order of Preachers, or Ordo Predicatorum, OP. And they became known as the Dominicans. And they were a learned order. And their whole point was, from the beginning, to be better educated than anybody else and to know the tradition so that they could convert. And they started also ministering to the people because it became almost impossible to really logistically bring about a kind of a mass, almost invasion of the East to convert the infidel. So they started working in Europe, and they too would go to the towns and the cities. As I said, the cities towns are rising, and they're growing. The population is continuing to grow, so there's a big population explosion. And they see a need to teach and educate the people within Christendom in the cities. And they start establishing churches and cloisters in the cities. They would become the most well-known scholars of the later Middle Ages, or the High Middle Ages in any case. But we'll talk more about that as we go through it. And so there was two of them. Now finally, the popes thought these guys are doing great. The Franciscans and the Dominicans, we can use the Dominicans against heresy too, and they did. The Dominicans became the inquisitors against, there was the Albigensian Crusade, heresy in southern France. And so there was an issue of the popes recognizing the benefit of these two new religious orders. So when it gets to later on in the 13th century, 1256, Pope Alexander IV said, we could really use these people, but we need somebody. We need really another one. And there's all these hermit groups in Italy. Why don't we just bring them all together and form one order? There's also one of the cardinals was really pushing for this idea, Cardinal Richard Annabaldi. And in 1256, that's what they did. It's called the Great Union, bringing together 4 hermit groups in Italy and forming the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, or the Ordo Eremitarum Sancti Augustini, because these hermit groups were all following the rule of St. Augustine, as actually did the Dominicans. Francis and the Franciscans followed their own rule, a newly created rule that developed over time from like 1209 to 1223, I believe it was. So there's a sense, though, that these Augustinian hermits were going to be dedicated to the bishops, as was Augustine himself, and would be preaching to the people explicitly in the cities. Whereas, at least originally, by their intent, Francis and his followers wanted to rebuild churches physically, and Dominic wanted to go off to the Middle East physically. This was formed to say we need to really focus on, we might use the term today, evangelizing the cities. Preaching and teaching in the city. Now, the Franciscans and the Dominicans were already doing that by fiat, basically, but the popes were saying they're not doing quite a good enough job, so we need to get kind of our own people there. And they formed this order. It took a while before the Augustinian hermits, as they became known, or later just simply the Augustinians. I mean, that gets kind of confusing, but we'll be talking more about that after the midterm. And it took them a while to form their own really kind of identity, because unlike the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who were established by very charismatic figures, Francis and Dominic, who followers flocked to them, the Augustinians were formed by the Pope. So it took them a while. They were kind of behind, and it took them a while to get all their rights and privileges and even their title. It took a while before it really became the uniformly, consistently used title for the order. It was kind of a bit ambiguous. And actually, I'm giving a paper in Rome in November on this very issue in terms of the title and the origins and developments of the order. But it was a way for the papacy to incorporate the poverty movement within the order, within obedience to the Pope and to the hierarchy, the bishops as well. Now, each of these mendicant orders were, by definition, outside of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the bishops. They weren't monks. They all were directly under the Pope, as was Cluny, as was the Cistercians, as were the Premonstratensians. So all of a sudden we have these new religious groups, and I'll talk more about this after the midterm too, but just kind of foreshadowing what's coming. There's starting to be a lot of tension between the parish priests within the cities and the new mendicant priests. So if you're a parish priest, all of a sudden your parishioners are flocking off to the Augustinians, the Dominicans, the Franciscans. Technically, they're supposed to be going to your parish. I'll be pointing out later too. This was a hidden income. All of a sudden, you're losing, your market, so to speak. You're losing your source of income to these religious orders, and there was a real crisis within the clergy. But we'll get to that after the midterm. But at first, it's this excitement of expansion and development of these new orders that would reinvigorate the church. You can see them as reforming orders. There's a phrase that was first formulated by Karl Barth, who was a Protestant theologian in the 19th century, and then used by Hans Kung, a Catholic theologian in the 20th century, and that is Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda. The church reformed, always to be reformed. And in some ways that is a very accurate description of the history of Christianity. Always a process of reforming, always in the state of being reformed. But we'll deal more with that concept of reformed and reformation when we get to later lectures after the midterm. But here, I just want to think about these kind of waves of reform movements. And the mendicants were this big wave of reform movements. And as I said, they became, in some ways, the most effective preachers to the people. They became the great best scholars of the Middle Ages, of later Middle Ages, and they were seen as a cut above. They really were. And they considered themselves as that, even though humility was one of the primary aspects of their mentality. They still realized that they were better educated. They were freer because they were outside of episcopal control. They were more dedicated and committed, and they could do a better job serving the people involved in pastoral care, the cura animarum. So it's a new kind of a thing that was going on, and their impact was obvious. Within a year, by the end of the 13th century, or even the later of the 13th century, Francis of Assisi, for example, became the patron saint of merchants. That would have been enough to make Francis turn in his grave. In some ways, it's a complete contradiction to the Franciscan ideal of poverty. But that's the impact they had. That the merchants, he said, who's going to be our patron saint? As they're starting to organize and everything, we're going to take Francis. Because this is also a time of increased trade, increased population. It was an exciting development in the 13th century. And it was not just because of the mendicants and the increased attempt to shape and form public opinion through preaching and teaching. It also became a development of educational institutions. And this brings me to the next slide, from cathedral schools to universities. And I talked about the 12th century Renaissance, or the medieval Renaissance, last lecture. And the centers of learning, and how, from Charlemagne's court establishing the palace school in Aachen, then pretty soon bishops started establishing the episcopal schools, in conjunction with the diocese and their episcopal palace and residency. And then there were the monastic schools, and I pointed at Paris. There was the episcopal school, the bishop school, cathedral school at the cathedral in Paris, where Abelard was. And then there was the monastic school of St. Victor's, not where St. Bernard was, but there was a different approach. But St. Bernard was in Clairvaux, and there was the monastic school there. So there's this tension in terms of approach to learning, approach of how we should be taught. So, but none of these centers of learning were universities. The university was the creation of the 13th century. Now, just a little background, going back to Abelard and the cathedral schools, because that's how it kind of worked with cathedral schools. If you wanted to teach the way it worked in a city, you'd go to a city and say, I want to teach. You would have to be granted the privilege to teach, the right to teach. So you'd have to go to the bishop and appeal for a license to teach, which would give you the jus docendi, the right of teaching. So the bishop would say, okay, well, whom have you studied? What's your background? Kind of what's your resume? And if it panned out that it was sufficient, the bishop would grant you the right of teaching, or the license to teach. This was still, though, not a university. But that's how Abelard got there. That's how all these other centers of learning people got there. And then you'd have to rent a place to live. You'd have to rent rooms for yourselves, where to hold lectures. There was no institution. And you would set up shop and say, hey, I'm here to teach. Come, listen to my lectures and pay me. In some ways, it was very entrepreneurial. It was some way very competitive. And that was kind of just how it all worked. And then as a student, you would either get to a certain point and then try to say, okay, well, I want to go be a teacher. Then you'd go out and be a teacher somewhere else and have to go through the same process. That was how it all kind of worked. Now, what happens was that there were, 3 different centers of learnings that were the most important for the emergence of the universities: Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Another thing here is if you ask an Italian scholar what is the first or what was the first university in Europe, the Italian scholar is going to say Bologna without question, going back to the 12th century with Frederick II and his privileges to the masters in Bologna, Authentica Habita. If you ask an English scholar, they're going to say, well, actually, Oxford is the first because we have evidence that that's where we first find the institutional form of a university at Oxford before Paris. But if you ask a French scholar, I would definitely say Paris. Now, I'm not going to go into all that debate because it doesn't really matter that much, but I am going to be talking about the model of Paris and using my presentation of the origins of the university based on Paris. Bologna was primarily a law school, and they didn't have all the different faculties until later. And so it depends on how you define a university. If you want to define a university as a series of privileges granted to masters, Bologna can certainly be seen as the first because that's what Frederick II, Emperor Frederick II, did in his bull Authentica or proclamation of Authentica Habita, established this corporation, a guild. I talked about the guilds last week, a guild of lawyers, because Bologna, there's a law school. And so this guild of lawyers, it was formed giving them rights and privileges to teach other lawyers and to certify the level of attainment of other lawyers. That's important. That is important for Paris and Oxford. I will be focusing on the model at Paris because even though there are these different models of university organization, Paris kind of became the standard. And it's also one I think we'll recognize to see how it kind of all developed. So just keep that in mind. I don't think I ever asked you on the quiz or in the midterm, which was the earliest or the first university. But what I want you to understand is to say, okay, how do we understand what was going on? And what were the faculties? Now, here I have the faculties and disciplines. There were basically one undergraduate faculty and three graduate faculties. The undergraduate faculty was typically known as the Faculty of Arts. It was the liberal arts, which were based on the classical 7 liberal arts. It became known as the 7 liberal arts. The trivium, consisting of rhetoric or grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, or we might say grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And then the quadrivium, with a fourfold division based on the, let's say, the mathematical sciences of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. You say, well, music isn't mathematical. Oh, yes, it is. It's all about proportion. It's all about proportion. In the medieval educational system in the classical liberal arts, it was related to astronomy and the relationship between the different spheres. It's still music. If you've ever had music theory, if you know anything about music theory, it's all based on intervals. Even when you're composing a song, you're consciously or not consciously using intervals. There's the octave, there's the scale. Those are all intervals of sounds. And sounds are based on the sounds a plucked string makes. I can talk a lot about that. That's a whole other issue. I won't spend your time on me talking about my music background and how I know some of these things. But it's very mathematical. Just take my word. And it's all about fractions and proportions, how it's related. So if you completed your trivium, you could go out and teach the trivium. It's equivalent to, let's say, a bachelor's degree. The degree structure is different. They didn't call it a bachelor's. You didn't receive a bachelor's once you've completed the trivium. You just had 3 years of university study. Then if you've completed the quadrivium and passed the disputations, I'll get that to a second, you could be said to be a Master of Arts. So there's no bachelor's at this point. There was simply the Master of Arts. And that would allow you to teach, or at least to apply for teaching. Then later on, you could go on and study theology, law, or medicine. Now, medicine was the least attractive. I mean, it's not what we consider medicine today. It's actually studying classical texts of medicine. There were a couple of different medical schools, but it was not the practical medicine. If you wanted to be a healer or a surgeon would be someone who would bleed people. We talk about, oh, how barbaric is that? You think you get sick and you go, and they say, well, you have to be bled. So a surgeon would bleed you, actually cut you and let you bleed. But the theory was that there were bad humors, which caused sickness. And so if you were sick, it means the humors of your blood got out of balance. So we had to let blood out in order to put them right and get them back into balance. There was no autopsy. There was no, actual practical research in medicine or in physiology or anything else. It was based on Galen and Galenic medicine, primarily back in the, I forget when Galen is. He's an ancient author. And it was almost saying that if you're studying medicine, you don't get involved in the practicalities. Yeah, that's medicine. Theology obviously was there to become part of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. To be a theologian, you could make your name, you could become famous, you could get an appointment, episcopal appointment, and go on from there. There's certainly career paths studying theology. The same in law, because there was civil law and ecclesiastical law. And civil law, there was some demand for, but ecclesiastical law, there was a lot, both for princely courts, because why would you want, if you're a prince, and why would you want an ecclesiastical lawyer? Because you're always dealing with the church, so you want to have somebody working for you that knows ecclesiastical law. You also want to know someone who would know civil law, so there becomes a big tension between the two different laws. And if you're a bishop or a pope, you're going to hire lawyers as well. So there gets to be this tension between law and theology, and it gets to be kind of an interesting career competition as it's developing in the course of the 13th century. Now, there were those aspects even before. I mean, we have, I said the law textbook goes back to Gratian in the mid-12th century, just about the time of Authentica Habitum being, the privileges being granted to the lawyers in Bologna. So all these developments are kind of working together. But still, it was kind of inchoate in terms of how it was all developing and emerging. And there was still no university until we have the institutional structure. Now here's where I go back to Paris and using Paris as the model. Now, the faculties and disciplines, I'll try to come back to them. Actually, I'll come back to them again after we get this university model done. And it all begins with town and gown conflicts. So this is the fourth bullet point on the slide, cathedral schools to universities. Town and gown conflicts. Now at Paris, which was a center of learning, a center of students and teachers coming to Paris to learn, because teachers would get reputations and students would want to go to study with them. That was the way it was with Abelard. And students who have always been students. They always have. And early on, this is two things. Early on, after term in 1209, there was a ruckus, and students were going out partying and raising hell. Went to a local wine innkeeper and trashed the place, and the innkeeper got really upset, and so got some of his friends, went back the next day, and just wailed on the students who had trashed his place and killed a couple of them. There was outrage by the other students and by the masters. How dare you do this? And so this is a conflict, what's called town and gown conflict. So, well, okay, blah, 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 blah. And this town and gown conflict was ongoing because on the one hand, the townspeople wanted the students and masters there. They were the ones who were going to the inns and the bars and patronizing them. They were those who were renting the rooms and buying the food. So there was a huge economic benefit. But then in 1229, it happened again. I'm not going to go through the whole history of the town and gown conflict between 1209 and 1229, that 20-year period. And another student was killed. So it's like, okay, the masters, so we've had enough. Because the masters are dependent for their livelihood on the students. They don't want the townspeople to kill their students, number one. Number two, a student could be arrested for breaking the law and hauled before the city court. That didn't usually work out well when they had committed crimes against the city, and the civil court would damn them, condemn them, and the master's like, we shouldn't do that. So the master says, we've had enough of our privileges, or we've had enough of this. So either you grant us privileges, bishop or pope, to protect us from these rogue townsmen, or we're going to leave. And bishop says, fine, leave. So it's called the Great Dispersion in 1229. The masters picked up and left, and they went to Oxford. And this is partly Oxford's claim to being the first university. What do you think would happen to Indianapolis if IUI just said all of a sudden, you know what? We quit. We're leaving. We're going to move to Fort Wayne. The city would not be happy. Because whatever the economic impact is, and I have no idea, but just think about it, of all the employees of IUI and all the students that come here, they have a huge impact on the economy of Indianapolis. If they all of a sudden, overnight, were to all leave, that would devastate the economy. Now, it took a while for the city of Paris to realize as much. And they started saying, please come back. And they said, no. Finally, it all ended in 1231 when the Pope got involved and said, okay, we will grant you privileges. And the bishop agreed, issuing the bull Par Inscientiarum, which is there on the next slide down, or bullet point down, in 1231. And Par Inscientiarum is really the foundation charter of the University of Paris. The University of Paris, previous to 1231, was certainly a famous, well-known center of learning with famous teachers there and students going there and flocking there, but it was not yet a university. What made it a university? Par Inscientiarum. How did it do so? Well, Par Inscientiarum was addressed to the universities of masters and students at Paris, Universitates Magistrorum et Studentium. Universities? Were there two universities? Yes, there were. Two universities. The term universitas means whole. It still does. Or the universe. The universe. The whole thing. This is corporate law. I talked about the guilds being the origins of corporate law, the guilds and the communes, and the word for whole, whereas the whole body functions as a legal person, the word for the word whole in Latin is universitas. There were universities of bakers and of blacksmiths, and so those were the guilds. What Par Inscientiarum did was to define the masters and students, the teachers, the masters, and the students, as guilds, incorporated guilds who could function as a single incorporated body, a legal person. And even though technically there were two universities, that soon became kind of abbreviated to just the University of Paris. That was the most important step. The incorporation of the guilds of masters and students. They gave them then a number of rights, Par Inscientiarum did. They gave them, both universities, the right to be considered as, first of all, clerics. They gave all students and masters the right to be considered as clerics. Cleric, part of the ordained. You say, what? That was a legal definition. So if you went to the University of Paris as a student, you were then legally defined as a clergyman. That means you had the rights and privileges of a clergyman. That means you if you got in trouble, you could be tried by ecclesiastical courts, not civil courts. Think about it today. There is the peer review process. There is the campus police, and I've heard some not great things about the campus police. But what would you, if you did something, let's say, illegal and near or around campus? I'm not suggesting that anybody would ever do something like that. I'm not talking about major crime. I'm not talking about theft or anything. Would you rather be picked up by a campus police or by the IMPD? I probably don't know enough to make that determination for you, but I know back in my day, the campus police was far preferable. I mean, did my undergraduate work at the University of Southern California in LA, and I didn't want to be picked up by the LAPD. So if you got caught by the campus police, it's like, okay, you don't want to be, but it was easier. And usually you were brought before a student peer review board who would sanction you for your misconduct instead of thrown into jail and given a fine. The whole point of that is that gave the students and masters at Paris the right to be judged by their peers, so to speak, rather than by the city. They also were given the right to use a single university seal, and this is where the singular comes in, to basically would say, this is an official document of the university. Now, a seal, is not the animal that goes, I can't imitate a seal. I love seals, but it's like the papal seal. It's like all these, the bishop's seal, the king's seal. It's that which seals a document or a letter that puts its imprint in wax. I refer to that too as the character. It gives it that special character in the wax. It seals the letter in the document. It's an important deal to have the seal. It is also, I think I may have boo-booed here. Let's see. No, I'm still here. Good. I saved that one. All of a sudden I clicked and hit the wrong button, and I was saying, am I going to have to go back and do a part 2 with this one, which I hope I won't have to do. But then I definitely kept my cool and came back. Anyway, okay. So they had the right to seal. They had the right to govern themselves, which means that they had the right to determine who could study, how to organize themselves, and they ended up organizing the students into nations, depending on where you were from. There's like 4 different nations within Paris. I'm not going to go into all the administrative developments of the University of Paris. These are just some of the basic rights that were granted by Par Inscientiarum. And then they were given the right to grant degrees or the license. They still had to be presented or conferred by the bishop or approved by the bishop, but the university could determine who would be presented. This is the real origin of degrees, university degrees. There was master. That was it. Master of Arts, or you could go on to become a master of laws, or a master of theology, or a master of medicine. The masters of theology, law, and medicine were all equivalent to what we would call a PhD, basically. It gave you the right to teach those anywhere. A student in the arts could go out and teach other places. I mean, there was a regulation that if you received your Master of Arts from Paris after fulfilling all the coursework and being approved by all the masters, you had to teach in Paris for a 3-year period, and then you could go anywhere. So first you had to teach in Paris, and then you could go and teach anywhere. If you had said that you have your Master of Arts in Paris, that was a big deal. It was a good way to get go out and set up shop as a teacher in another town somewhere. And then, as I already said, theology, law were the 2 primary paths to moving up in the world in terms of career development. And that was all in but these faculties, faculty of arts, faculty of law, faculty of medicine, faculty of theology, all regulated themselves. And so that's kind of what this is all about. We begin to see this structure being one that we recognize with degrees and promotion or graduation, license. You receive the license to teach. The license is still a degree in Britain, in England, and Canada, the licentiate. If you receive your licentiate, you receive your license to teach. Here we have a bachelor's, and they ended up calling bachelor's too. So if you finished, your 3-year trivium degree, you could get your bachelor's and go out, but it really wasn't worth much. You get a job teaching kids in a small town, teaching them the rudimentary things, but you're not like the Master of Arts. So that was kind of the structure. I just want to say a couple more things about this. Let me just check on this. Well, I'll save this for the next one because that will work well. I don't need to bring that in right here. But with Par and Scientiarum, we have the emergence of an institution of the university. And from that point on, we have universities, a distinctively Western educational institution with rights and privileges that was not there before, 13th century. It was not there anywhere in the East. There were centers of learning, great centers of learning, without question. But there were no universities. This whole corporate structure and nature of an institutional development. That's what a university is, and that's what a university still is. Now, the teaching and learning at a university began to be referred to as scholastic. You may read in your textbook, I forget, I should have gone back and checked, I didn't, but if you read about the Middle Ages, you'll often hear it referred to as being scholasticism and scholastic. You may have heard about scholasticism. There's a lot of debate about that. Most of that is simply later uses of a term. What it refers to are the schoolmen, the scholastics, those who were scholars. So scholars as a group and what was going on as scholars formed the scholastics. Now, we have appeared to a scholastic method, and there did develop a basic method for university teaching, from the arts to the theology to law, medicine, and became increasingly based on Aristotle. And became based on the question. Now, the question would be like saying, okay, is it true that it's better to know, or it's better to will the good than it is to know the truth? Well, it can be argued in either way. The scholastic method developed was having a question, answering it one way, then showing the opposite arguments, then analyzing it all, and then giving a response. The whole approach to teaching was based on debate. There were no tests. There still weren't yet university-owned buildings. There began to be that after Par and Scientiarum. One of the earliest is Robert Sorbonne, a very wealthy nobleman in Paris, established the College of Sorbonne, which is still around, the Sorbonne. Buildings and residence halls for students and for poor students who could go. Anyway, the point is that it was an approach to teaching. It was a method of teaching. And it began to be increasingly based on Aristotle. Aristotle, early on, as he was being recovered and translated, the arts faculty, younger, number one, than the theology and law and medicine faculties, were all into Aristotle. It was a new thing. It was the latest trend, and I thought it was great. And so when Aristotle's natural philosophy started to be translated, they wanted to teach it, because the teaching in this question consisted of reading a text. You didn't take a course on a theme. There was no Western civilization courses. There were no physics courses. You'd read Aristotle's physics, or you'd read some other text before Aristotle's physics was allowed on physics. The master would read the text and then offer his analysis commentary on it. In the afternoon, you'd meet with a graduate student to talk about it, go over it, make sure that you copied down the text correctly. You had to copy it. and you basically had to memorize it. And then there would be debates, where as a student you'd be selected for a debate, and another student would be selected as a debate called a disputation. And the master would give you the problem of the question and say, okay, Bob, you have to teach, you have to take this side of it, and Bill, you have to take the other side of it. And you'd argue. It was very much a basis of debate, and you could not use notes. You had to have everything from memory. So if you're arguing about a text, you have to have that memorized. And so the better you know it, the better you will do. And the better your logic and arguing is, the better you will do. And you have to pass a certain number of disputations before you can be presented to promote to receive your license. Graduate. With Aristotle becomes, by the mid-13th century, the basically only, not completely only, but the overwhelmingly predominant texts that were lectured on. Arts faculty would lecture on Aristotle's texts, and they were prescribed. They were prohibited early on, and then finally the popes just gave up and said, okay, we're not going to win this one. So Aristotle became the foundation of the curriculum. Now, if you were an art student, you would go to university when you were about 14 years old. Instruction was all in Latin. You couldn't become a master of arts until I think you were 20. I think you had to be at least 20. So it usually was also a few years later. And then you had to teach for 3 years before you could go to graduate school. So number one, you had to be able to read and write and listen and speak Latin before you went to university. And then you spent a lot of time listening to lectures, and then you had to finally go on to get your Master of Arts, and then you had to teach the arts at Paris, and then you could go on to a graduate faculty in theology or law faculty of theology. It took about, I think I figured it out, in the 14th century anyway, but in the 13th it probably was about the same, at least 14 years before you could become a Master of Theology. So that is a long time of study, a lot of study. Now, we'll see how that changes later on. But at this point, it's a lot of study. Law, I'm not sure. It was also a long period. Law students were also usually older. So you have this dynamic at a university of older theology and law students. They're in Paris together with the younger crowd of the art students. And interestingly, too, the mendicant orders, members of the mendicant orders, number one, were exempt from having to go through the arts curriculum, because the mendicant, they taught themselves. The mendicants had their own school set up. They were not part of the university, except for at times, eventually, an individual mendicant theologian would be appointed to the faculty of theology at the universities, and then there was a connection between in the case of the Dominicans, I think Albert the Great was one of the first, or Alexander Hales of the Franciscans, one of the first Franciscans, would be, if you're a student, you could study in Paris, and you could even study with Albert the Great, but not at the University of Paris, at the Studium Generale, the General School of Studies in Paris. So it gets kind of complex, but what I want you to know is that there began to be this tension between what's called the regulars and the seculars, as I already referred to. Now I'm jumping ahead. Later on, somewhere into lay culture, vernacular culture. That's the next slide even. But anyway, it's this whole approach to teaching and education and learning and lecturing as a whole became known as scholasticism. It was a method of teaching, a method of learning as part of the university curriculum and structure for all the different faculties. It's only later scholars who have made more of it than it was, who have said it was the attempt to fuse faith and reason, to combine Christianity and Aristotle in this great synthesis. I'll be coming back to that and why I think that's complete nonsense, but that's another issue. So I just want you to know, aware of it. It also became a derogatory term of logic chopping. You may have heard the thing, the scholastics were so out of, they asked how many angels could dance on the head of a pen. There's no evidence that that question was ever asked, but it very well could have been, and also because it's a very interesting question, actually. Because what it gets at is there a mass to angels? Do angels have mass? There's spiritual substance. So does spiritual substance have mass? Does God have mass? They used the word mass. They knew what mass was. Matter, material. Anyway, that's beyond the point. The point was that the questions asked were designed to show different arguments on both sides. This is all based on logic, and increasingly then on Aristotelian logic. And the whole basis of your education was tested by, examined by debate. So the better you were with logic and the more precise you could be, the better you would do. So it becomes very logic oriented. And it becomes very Aristotelian oriented. It becomes very much disputationally oriented. And we'll see how that goes from there. Now, I have up there the Summas and the comprehensive treatment based on logic. I have Arts and Theology Conflict. I have Aristotle. All those in terms of scholastic culture, referring to university culture. I talked about last time that when Aristotle was translated into Latin, he often was translated into Latin along with his Arabic commentators, primarily Avicenna and then Avesbron. There were other Arabic scholars who also became translated into Latin, who were talking about Aristotle. There began to be conflicts between the arts faculty and the theology faculty, because you can see this almost like, how do you deal with themes that are both philosophical and theological? How do you deal with the concept of the eternity of matter? For Aristotle, matter is eternal, but for Christianity and for Judaism, but that wasn't an issue at the time, in the medieval universities, Jews had their own schools. It was by creation. So if in the arts faculty you're being taught Aristotle's De Caelo et Mundo, which gets at his treatise on the heavens and the earth, getting at the origins of everything, you're being taught that matter is eternal. That's kind of this Aristotelian perspective from original matter. It all kind of develops. And then theology is like, no, that's not the way it was. God created. And there are a number of other issues that were treated both by the arts faculty and by the theology faculty. So there began to be faculty disputes over who has the right to teach those themes. It wasn't really settled. It's a long story. There's tensions all along. Then there began to be tensions, too, between the secular theologians and the regular theologians. I'll be saying more about this in a minute. And then this is a time, too, when we see it's the great period of the Summas. Thomas Aquinas is most famous, is Summa Theologica. He also wrote a Summa Contra Gentiles. And a Summa here is just simply a comprehensive treatment. A comprehensive treatment against the Gentiles, or against the Jews and the infidel, where Thomas puts forth a number of questions to try to prove why Christians are right and the Jewish or Islamic solution is wrong. He then wrote this Summa Theologica, a comprehensive treatment of theology. It's a major work still being commented on by theologians and by philosophers. It has ever since Thomas wrote it. He wrote it as an introduction to theology for beginning theology students. It's an amazing piece of work, and it's brilliant, whatever you might want to think about Thomas or not. You cannot say he was not a brilliant person. But just think of that attempt to say, I'm going to write a summa of everything. This is also the great time, the 13th century, of these world chronicles. Same kind of an approach. We are now in a position where we can summarize and bring together a single understanding of all knowledge. And we can do so based on the scholastic method. Now, I'm not going to say much more about that here, because I need to move on this lecture. But it was an impressive development within a single century. I mean, Thomas dies in 1274, so even 3/4 of a century. In some ways, even half a century. It's an amazing series of growth and inspiration and newness and development, intellectual curiosity. Yes, in 1277, the bishop had to condemn a number of propositions, because one of the way around this conflict between theology and the arts faculty or philosophy faculty was to claim that, yeah, but we're teaching it philosophically and they're teaching it theologically, so if there's a conflict, it doesn't matter, it's just because we're doing it differently. That began to be seen as the so-called doctrine of double truth. There was never a doctrine of double truth that anyone advocated. But in the condemnations of 1277, the doctrine of double truth was condemned, that you cannot say that there is a double truth. What is true in philosophy can be false in theology or vice versa. Truth is unified. Anyway, we'll see more of this development as we go through after the midterm. But I hope you can get a sense of this is a real flourishing and culmination of the intellectual development from approximately the year 1000 till the end of the 13th century, as being this massive intellectual awareness, awakening, developing interest, with logic and reason leading the way. And that also gets to this issue of lay culture and vernacular culture. And I have up here on the next slide, then moving along, secular and regular clergy. I've already addressed that, and I've already addressed students as clerics by definition. But I also said that university students were always university students. Just because they were legally defined as clerics doesn't mean they were, now we're pious and religious in any way, shape, or form. And we have, letters. I'm going to just refer to two because I think they're so fantastic. From a university student in Paris back to his father. And it was, "Dear Dad, thank you so much for sending me here. I've made a very good start. I've been going to my lectures. I like my instructors, but I have to say that the city is very expensive. I have to rent lodgings, I have to buy food, and I have to provide for a number of other things that I'm not going to hear talk about. Please send more money. Love, your son." Now, that's an actual letter. It's a paraphrase, but it's an actual letter in terms of this letter designates food, lodgings, and other things, etc. We have then also a letter from a father to his son in Paris. This is not a direct answer to the one I just gave you, but it is an answer to a letter a father received. It was, "Dear son, I've been hearing reports that you've been not attending lectures, that you've been hanging out with your friends, going into the pubs, drinking a lot of wine and playing your guitar and not paying attention to your study. I need to hear a positive report, or I'm going to bring you home and we'll go back to work and we'll go from there, because that is not why I sent you to Paris." It's like, they haven't changed. And just because they're referred to as clerics doesn't mean that they had any kind of a religious conversion. They're Christians. Of course they're Christians. Everybody in Christendom at this time were Christians. That doesn't mean they are one way, or they believe one thing, or that they have one set of morals. I've already talked about Abelard and Eloise in terms of individuality and free thinking, and how they're huge and fair and everything. Well, students are always that way. And we also have the tension between this lay culture, and even though the students were classified as clerical, we have lay culture and vernacular culture kind of conflicting with the official, established ecclesiastical culture. So in some ways that goes back to cult culture and scholastic culture, and it gets all kind of mixed up, these different varieties of how to live your life and what are the mores. The mores in Latin are the customs. It's the basis of our word morals. And I have up there the Romance of the Rose. And I'm not going to go into the whole history here, I don't have the time. But the Romance of the Rose, there began to be in the 12th century the development of vernacular romance literature. Part of the Renaissance of the 12th century, the medieval Renaissance on into the 13th. And I would love to say a lot more about it because it's very important. It's often not presented. It is skewed to the views of the modern interpreter. There was medieval pornography. The Romance of the Rose was not that, I can promise you, but it was very risque. It says dream vision, and this is later 13th century. Dream vision of a lover and his beloved arose, and the whole thing, and then it is started by one individual, Guillaume de Lorry, and then it's finished by Jean de Meun in the early 14th century. And Jean de Meun, they're both students at the university. And by this time, Jean de Meun has been arguing this really a parody of what became known as courtly love literature, which starts in the 12th century. And I said there's pornography, but there's also this elevation of love and courtly love. But there's a parody. It's from very early on. There's parody. It's not this romantic tradition of the love of putting the woman on the pedestal. Supposedly that's where all those ideas come from. But it's also the basis of actually, you know what? True love has to be illegitimate. It has to be extramarital. Because the nobility didn't marry for love. They married because of political alignment. But it's not that they didn't have those emotions or those feelings. So all this literature that is written about between a lover who's married and his beloved, a lady who's also married, they're having an affair on the side, and it's that kind of love literature going back and forth. Or it's the person who loves the woman, the young knight who loves the woman, but she's already married, so she can't have him. So it's the pining and yearning for that view. Romance of the Rose basically turns some of this romantic love literature, romantic chivalric literature. Now, chivalry are the mores of the knighthood. Chevalier is a knight in French, a horse, someone who rides a horse. I said a mounted warrior. That's where it all comes. So chivalry is the code of ethics or the morals of courtly culture and the knighthood. It was very much a part of the university because the nobility would flock to the universities, especially the lower nobility, because but also the heir would need to have to the principality, whatever it might be. The states would need to have some level of education, and then the other family could go there and become a theologian or a lawyer and move up in the church. So if you have your brother as bishop, you got it made. And if you have your brother as bishop with your cousin as pope, that's even better. So it's that kind of strategic planning all around. So that's why this university culture is both this combination of courtly culture, lay culture, clerical culture, and ecclesiastical culture all in one together. And the Romance of the Rose ridicules all of that. And basically, again, it's kind of thick, and it's a great read. I often assign it in my high and later medieval Europe courses. That's why I say it's not pornography, but essentially, when it comes down to it, it's a long story about a rape. Because the lover finally obtains his beloved, his rose, by force. He has to attack the castle. It's not that clear because the rose is hidden away by all kinds of things, and so he has to really fight for his love. But it's an issue of fighting for his beloved that he finally wins. And whether that's a rape or not, you can kind of read it in different ways. But it is a fantastic book. It's been called a mirror of the entire Middle Ages, and it was one of the most popular works of the later Middle Ages, and it was banned repeatedly. It was banned repeatedly, but what happens when you ban something? It becomes more popular, and that's what happened with the Romance of the Rose. But it really gets at, it shows and reveals that there's no monolithic medieval culture. There's no, people didn't think for themselves. They just believed whatever the Pope said. This is the age of faith. It is, there's a great, one of the figures, one of the personified figures is a friar who is the this is all an inversion, and his servant of nature, nature is a figure there, is, he goes out to tell all the noblemen, go out and he says, plow, 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 which means, have sex, renew your lineage, because that's what, and he damns the whole clerical celibacy. He said that is, it does so in almost very veiled allegory of how horrible and anti-human the whole concept of clerical celibacy is. And so it's like, okay, yes, it was condemned, so what? It really reveals some of the underlying tensions that were there, some of the attitudes that were there all the while. And it shows the complexities of medieval culture. Yeah. If we move beyond, we then go to the last slide here, the medieval synthesis, because in so many ways, all these different mores, all these different ethics and moralities and cultures, clerical culture, court culture, lay culture, peasant cultures, scholastic culture, they all kind of were there all at once, and there's conflicts and tensions, and yet somehow they form a whole. The synthesis idea, I said I would come back to it, until the 1960s anyway, was one of the primary theories for interpreting the Middle Ages, and it all kind of developed towards this grand synthesis, whereby faith and reason harmonized finally. And I would argue that's baloney. Number one, and I'm not going to go into all of this actually. I'm not going to go into the details of it because it would take too long, and in some ways I find the whole debate too tedious. Faith and reason for the time. I'm not talking about later developments. I'm talking about at the time, in the Middle Ages, were never seen to be in conflict. Thomas viewed faith as completing and extending reason. The whole approach and attitude and shift towards secondary causation, which I talked about last lecture with Adelard of Bath, was saying we have not lost the use of our minds, so let's return to reason. When we can't understand something, we'll appeal to God, but otherwise let's look at our reason. There was a realm that reason could not go beyond. In some ways, it was formulated by the theologians that reason could prove that God was, but reason could not know what God was. Reason could not know revelation. That gets into the whole basis of reason and revelation, which is not the same as faith and reason. There's two different origins and sources of truth. Also, I'm writing a book about this in terms of with respect to theology and what is theology as a discipline. So that's, in some ways, I know what I'm talking about here. It was an issue of how do we treat one and the other, and how do they relate, and do they synthesize? Of course they do. I mean, my God, reason. If we're creatures of God, creations of God, God created reason, so that's part of it. We can't have faith and reason disagreeing because we're one and the same. So that's the issue here. This is going to be very important for later on in understandings and interpretations of what happens in the 14th century, because I think I've already said it often was that the whole development of the Middle Ages rises to a point and then it crashes, and then it slowly comes back. That crash was based on the dissolution. There's even a book that was written in the 50s, early 60s called The Dissolution of the Medieval Outlook, 14th century, and the destroying of this synthesis. And so what this is all based on Thomistic scholars who followed Thomas, or thought they were. Every time there's an ism, Thomism is a perversion of Thomas. Augustinianism is a perversion of Augustine. Lutheranism is a perversion of Luther. Calvinism is a perversion of Calvin. We'll get into those other issues later on. Scholasticism is a perversion of the scholastics. So it was like these later scholars who felt they were being loyal to Thomas misinterpret Thomas by not really understanding this synthesis and what it meant for Thomas. But he's saying there's no argument between the arts faculty and the theological faculty. They both are needed and go together. That's the whole context of it all. That's what we have to understand and get to. That the Middle Ages was a dynamic period, and we should almost see it as an age of reason. I think I said Edward Grant, great historian of medieval science, has a book on the Middle Ages and Age of Reason. Um, Rather than this age of faith, it's not to say that there's a conflict. The conflict of reason and faith really only arose in the context of the reactions to the Enlightenment and the reactions to Darwin. There are little pre-developments thereof with reactions to Copernicus. That's not originally. There's a whole issue called the flat Earth and flat Earth theories. No one in the Middle Ages thought the Earth was flat. They all knew it was round. The Greeks knew it was a sphere. They measured the circumference. But it's a changing paradigm and understanding. And with Galileo in the 17th century, so none of this is part of your midterm, don't worry, or even part of this class, really. Galileo saw new evidence, so it wasn't just theory. It was new evidence, observed information, because Galileo had a telescope. Copernicus didn't. No one else ever had. And there was resistance by some to that. Now, already with Copernicus, there was factions who supported Copernicus and factions who didn't. Those factions who did not deny Copernicus for reasons of faith or belief. Aristarchus of Samos, I think I referred to maybe 235 BCE, advocated a heliocentric universe, and the Greek natural philosophers, long before Christianity, said you're crazy, no, and rejected it. Not for reasons of religion or belief, because it didn't make sense within their scientific understanding. The best scientists of the day rejected Copernicus. Galileo, you couldn't do so quite so easily. And the followers of Galileo started referring to those people who denied Copernicus as ridiculing, almost being ironic. Oh, they believe the world is flat. That's how ridiculous they are. And that became that moniker of you flat earther. You're so backwards, you think the world's flat. And it was only in the 19th century that there started people really saying, wait a minute, it is flat. It's a bizarre development. Anyway, but that is in that context that all of a sudden faith and reason started to be seen in opposition. It wasn't always before. There's no opposition. Throughout this course, there's no opposition. We can say, well, there begins to be opposition in the 17th, 18th century. Well, okay, maybe. It's more like, Christianity is attacked, or at least a certain understanding of Christianity is attacked with the Enlightenment, and on we go, and people start, there's the rise of self-proclaimed atheists. So there is some of that setting the scene for the whole Darwin problem. But in the Middle Ages, there's no conflict between faith and reason whatsoever. We should see the Middle Ages as the age of reason. Now, I'll talk about the whole development of the so-called Renaissance after the midterm. That too has negatively impacted our understanding of the Middle Ages. Not so much from the Renaissance scholars themselves as from Renaissance scholars in the later 19th century and on into the 20th century, but we'll get there when we get there. That's what's the clouds before the storm is, with all this development and progress and population booming and trade booming and everything changing and development. We see all these fissures within the feudal structure. It's like something has to break, something has to give, and it does. It's not so much a boom from a synthesis, but there is a population. And we'll see all about that after the midterm. We're talking about the crumbling of Christendom, not the dissolution of the medieval outlook or the loss of the synthesis. But there were a series of crises that came about, and we'll talk about those when we get there. But for the midterm, it goes to the end of the 13th century, this business of the heyday and of medieval development and expansion. The age of reason, the age of trade, the age of Aristotle, of science, the age of vernacular literature, the age of Latin understanding, and the attempt to summarize all that is known. could go on and on, but I'll leave it there for now. If you have any questions, just ask, as always. Good luck on your midterm. I'll be looking forward to reading them. Be sure to review the guide to writing the midterms, a list of the terms to know, and historical argument. Those are the three documents you should really look at again before writing your second midterm. Take my feedback on your first midterm into account, and still know that this is all practice leading up to the final exam. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.